Everyone, welcome to Champion Briefs Topic Analysis. I'm your writer, Michael Norton. I'm here to talk to you about the NCFL resolution, which reads, Resolved. The main goal of U.S. public education should be to eliminate racial and economic achievement gaps. So overall, first, congrats on qualifying to the NCFL National Tournament. Truly one of my favorite tournaments every single year. I really hope that I can be there. A lot of my good friends are going to be there. I'm telling you, it's going to be a great tournament. So before I jump into the topic itself, some things to know in terms of context of the topic. So first, I'm sure a lot of you have heard a lot of things about the NCFL tournament. So if you've been to like a debate camp like an NDF, like a Harvard, like a Capital, I'm sure you've heard that the NCFL National Tournament has a comparatively poor judging field compared to other tournaments like the TOC, like Yale, etc., etc. So the number one thing to know is the TOC field is very different from the NCFL field. But at the same time, the NCFL field is definitely very competent. Sure, you've got your inexperienced judges like the parents, the siblings, the local hires, the on-again, off-again coaches, etc., that you don't want to have. But remember that every single one of your rounds is paneled and that there are a lot of people being brought in like college debaters, dedicated coaches, and former PF debaters that will be in your field. So recognize this isn't just a debate tournament where you lay out all the best rhetoric you've got and win your rounds. This is still a debate tournament at its core, and sure you see a lot of success from teams you might consider random, but remember that at the end of the day, you're still winning debates in front of the eyes of the public. So at the same time, keep in mind the strategical differences that occur in topics at the NCFL. Recognize that first speaking team is always the team on the affirmative. So if that has any relevance to your strategy, whether you think that you're a team that maybe leans towards the negative, but then remembers that they have second speaker and prefers second speaker, that's something you should lean on in out rounds if you ever get there and actually get some sort of side choice. Because remember that in rounds are all prepared. So again, all of the rounds are designated on speaking position based on which side an individual team ends up on. So now let's talk about the actual topic. So I actually sort of like their topic choice, and I know that I'm very different in that. I like this topic choice in that you can't just throw contentions around willy-nilly like this is some like Wild West gunslinger show. This is a focused debate regarding whether the current state of education mandates a change in approach that effectively allocates rights comparatively better than the system we have in the status quo. So as a result, the ultimate strategy on this topic, and you're hearing this from me now, will be one that is a clear strategy that defines its ground and does direct juxtaposition of their arguments against the arguments of the other side. A good example of this is in your summary or your final focus, just standing up and saying, look, even if you buy their arguments about X, Y, or Z, or even just doing an analysis of what the world is that you get as a result and what their best world is, just saying, look, if you compare the con world to the pro world, the affirmative world clearly outweighs, and then just do that analysis, because I think that a lot of the weighing I've seen over the course of the year hasn't really been rhetorical. So I think that a good way to phrase this for a lot of you is to simply dedicate some time to weighing on this topic, because it's going to be very important as to what the government should focus on, because there's such a centralized aspect of this topic that you really need to hit. And I think that you truly can't focus on that without the really in-depth weighing that you're going to get when you use those sorts of analogies. So the second aspect of the strategy is you need to be rhetorical. And I don't mean belay, as so many of you like to say. So the judges you get at NCFL aren't the ethos-hungry card hacks from the TOC who just hear X said Y, therefore I'm going to vote for you. Like, when you talk about rights debate, especially in front of this sort of audience, particularly at a tournament like the NCFL, it's your burden to go one step further when warranting your arguments. You need to talk about why a right is important in terms of accessing other aspects of an individual's personhood. And you need to talk about how it's violated directly by said policy. Don't just kind of hint at it and dodge it. You need to be specific about the rights violation and why it's a meaningful rights violation. And third, make clear the full impact. What is the scope of the policy? If you can demonstrate that there are literally hundreds of thousands of individuals that are being structurally disenfranchised and prevented from entering society as a result of the framework of the education system, that's more than enough for you to win this debate on the pro side of the House. And I think that you can easily do that if you prove that you don't have any of the central structures like affirmative action that can actually end up helping out people that we don't really benefit from the status quo. So I want to talk about the sides in terms of where the ground lies. So on the affirmative, I think you should focus on how rights are things that the United States really needs to strive to protect in absolute situations, regardless of the utilitarian outcomes, and how the aptitude-based markers for only some students that you would get in the system where you don't prioritize reducing these sorts of gaps will like only exacerbate the disparities and make them much, much worse. Give a lot of examples of things like double jeopardy protections or due process, where the United States allocates rights over something like utility, and stating that just like having a competing interest in something doesn't mean you have a competing right to something, which functions as a great substitute for the ethos hacking judge that's just looking for a clear place to say, I understand where I want my vote to be. So your job as the negative team is a little bit more peculiar. Your job is to argue about the extent of government protection of rights, and that a facilitative right is not necessarily meaningful unless you can demonstrate a compelling state interest, and just arguing that that bright line exists beyond whatever the compelling interest is, and that the state is already like fulfilling a minimal role of protecting individuals and shouldn't necessarily intervene in rights any further. Give some examples of where the United States government opts not to facilitate the accessing of rights when it comes into conflict with the full expression of another person's right, and that's like all over society. Like a good example of this is when someone's religion, for example, mandates that they engage in religious jihad. Like clearly the United States government isn't going to facilitate their ability to access that right. Even if they have a right to do it, it doesn't mean that the government should, and clearly they don't have a right to do it in that case, but even if they did, then the government clearly shouldn't facilitate it. There's lots of times when there's a competing rights claim. Just argued that there's a competing rights claim of the students that are losing out on a better education, better aptitude, better life when you decide to change the curriculum in a way that definitely skews the test scores away from them. So let's get to the arguments. So I took a look at the brief, and I think you guys are really going to like the brief, because I think a lot of the arguments they get in there are kind of the fragments that you need to establish the necessary solvency and also diverse approach to fit into the paradigm that I'm discussing. Because don't get me wrong, you definitely do need a lot of arguments, and you definitely need a strong foundation. But what they all feed into is this general framework of whether something's a facilitative right or not. So you can use the argument about how like women are definitely harmed by the current system in the United States, and about how we're just not allocating enough money towards certain school districts, and then you get a lot of schools like ones that people debate at, where there's just an excessive amount of money going into one public school and then zero going into another just because of political standing. So those are a lot of great arguments that could demonstrate that really there are a lot of places where people aren't accessing those rights. So yeah, definitely dig into the brief for those sorts of arguments. Here's just a few that are great for this sort of paradigm. So first, just establishing that education is a facilitative right, talking about how facilitative rights permit the accessing of other rights and therefore are a keystone, and then talking about why it's necessary for the government to intervene in this sort of situation, about how students are being denied the full brunt of education when you don't focus on them, and about how their world is a world where they deny individuals of their rights down the line in situations where they won't be educated, meaning they won't necessarily know how to access other rights like voting, healthcare, etc. Another thing to talk about is improving like utilitarian outcomes, arguing that there's a competing interest in improving the standing of these individuals beyond this, talking about how you can generate diversity throughout the school system and improve the racial standing by decreasing income disparities, and the structural racist barriers being torn down will definitely benefit society. I think that there's definitely a lot of impacts that you can reach for there. You can also talk about how you create a more equitable system which creates a nature of education that's a lot more stomachable. I think that there's a situation where there's like a culture of poverty in a lot of societies where like you get a teacher from like Teach for America who doesn't necessarily know how to teach to a culture of poverty and then just kind of flops and leaves the system. So a lot of the great arguments are about how like you get better teachers on one side because you attract teachers from all places who understand how to teach in certain places. Because if you take a person like me, like Michael Norton, raised in state of Maine, I would probably not know how to educate in a stone cold like culture of poverty. So you need a certain person for that. And when a system is designed to handle that sort of situation, you can definitely access it. So there's your solvency for the harms, the racial standing, and you've already demonstrated a rights claim. So definitely you can form a coherent and strong affirmative on this topic. So eat it. You clearly can. So now the negative. So I think that you need a more focused argument on this side. You just need to kind of establish why this doesn't necessarily pass that bright line. The first place is whether or not you need to meet the burden of education. So first you can talk about how the current state of education is already fulfilling the necessary bright line as to when the state needs to provide certain services as a baseline. Because even though you can argue that the system is not perfect, you can still argue that the right is being fulfilled and that everyone has a right to some degree of education and to the same chance once they get into the system, and that the state doesn't need to intervene in other people's right to a subjective good life just because someone's screwing up in school. So arguing that someone has a right to a fair school once they actually enter school, which I think is a fair argument. To argue that there's like some like degree of cosmic justice protecting everybody's rights is probably not something that I would get behind. But to argue that like the state has some sort of compelling interest to ensure that somebody's right to education isn't getting overridden and that like we're just trotting everybody else through and creating a disparate society. Like I think this is the metaphor that a lot of people try to portray with the affirmative action debate, which is that, like, in a world with affirmative action, you're just kind of like pushing wealthy white people aside. Like, that's not the world that you necessarily need to defend. What you just need to say on the negative side is that we think that rights are being conflicted with when you decide to make the main focus of something, and instead of a good education system that's designed on helping everyone, helping a certain degree of people. And I definitely think that there's an argument there. But you also argue that this diminishes the comprehensive value of education. You don't make the goal of education to actually spur innovation, to actually gain aptitude that people concede to be good. So it means that you can't meaningfully focus on other means of education, so other people can't self-actualize. The United States falls behind. So there's definitely a lot of pragmatic arguments on this side that can be used to weigh against that competing rights claim if some affirmative team does try to establish that. So there's your framework. I think the affirmative clearly needs a strong rights-respective framework as well as some sort of utilitarian means of arguing. And then I think the negative just needs to go hard on where that bright line exists and why the value of education is something that we do need to cherish for every individual, and why you're definitely hurting the value of every education when you decide to focus on one specific paradigm. So that's all from here. I think, again, you need to focus on weighing. You need to make this a great tournament by running arguments that follow that specific framework. And I think all of you guys have a chance at breaking. It's a very open break this year, and I hope all of you had fun at NCFL. So that's all from now. I'm Michael Norton with Champion Briefs. Have a good tournament.